Good afternoon, folks. Welcome. Welcome to the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries monthly Lunch and Learn webinars. My name is Paul Anderson. I'm the Executive Director at Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. We're based in Stonington, Maine. Small nonprofit doing great big things for fisheries of Maine. Our mission is to help sustain commercial fishing in Eastern Maine and beyond, and the fishing communities that depend on fishing. So we organize our work generally in collaborative ways around research, management, and education. But what we find, and I think you'll hear a bit today, is that those three items are not intended to be separate. We actually integrate across all of those. And so this is an education opportunity to share with you some of the work that we're doing in collaborative management. And we have Mike Thalhauser with us. He's our collaborative management specialist here at MCCF. And he's gonna, as you can see from the title, he's gonna talk about his work on alewives and shellfish, where there are very real and active collaborative management opportunities in Maine. But he's also gonna talk about some of the other fisheries in Maine and whether and how they can and should be collaboratively managed. We're doing these monthly on the last Friday of each month. I hope you've been here before, and if you're new to us, welcome, and keep an eye out. We'll be doing these through the course of the summer as well. So thanks for joining us, and after Mike's talk, I think we probably leave 10 or 15 minutes for a Q&A, and we'll be facilitating that when we get there. So take it away, Mike.
All right, thanks, Paul, and Paul's going to help facilitate that Q&A at the end. I appreciate the intro. Yep, my name is Mike Thalhauser. I'm our co-management specialist, and like Paul said, I'll talk about co-management by itself, some kind of deep dives in alewives and shellfish, and then sort of glance at some of the other fisheries in Maine. Like Paul said, we're down here at the edge of the wharf in Stonington, the largest lobster landing port in the country, not the world, and we deal with collaborative research, collaborative management, and collaborative education, and really try to tie those in to help sustain our communities and our fisheries. So I'll start really at the basis of what co-management is. It's something that we have it's not the easiest concept to get across, co-management. So part of our work is really getting people to get it and to understand what co-management is. And it might sound really simple, and it kind of is. It's basically, in the simplest terms, the joint management of a common resource. So we've got this example up here, and I use an alewife there, a river herring. I'll use those kind of terms interchangeable, and it requires joint management of that species. So typically you have, really any multiple parties you could call co-management, but typically with fisheries you'll have a state and or the federal government who really has the authority over fisheries management, and then it's the idea that management and responsibilities therein can be shared between them and stakeholders or outside parties, whether that's fishermen that are spending their time, their lives out on the water with these resources, or community members or universities, other institutions that have some sort of vested interest in this resource. And really, a lot of people try to look at this and say, okay, well, who's making the decision? What's the decision-making process? How do things get decided? Who's in charge of what? And really, it's hard to do that because you have every different species really requires a different sort of co-management system. And it's a much better way to look at it as a problem-solving process or a relationship that really takes a lot of want to be in it, and it takes conversations, negotiations, learning together, and I would say most importantly, trust among the co-managers. And really the reason why, you might say it's a heck of a lot simpler, just have, Joe Schmo manager be in charge of this, or the fisherman be in charge of it, or whatever. But what this does is it really brings capacity from all those different pieces of collaborative management. And so we're going to sort of dive first and most deeply into river herring or alewives as a way to look at what that capacity is and to kind of show why co-management is really the way to go. Excuse me, I've got some seasonal flu stuff going on, so I'll be drinking a bunch of water. So I'm just going to quickly go through a little bit of the river herring or alewife life cycle just to give some ideas of the scale at which these fisheries and these fish exist. So they're anadromous fish. They're little silvery things about a foot long, and they spend most of their life in the marine environment. But luckily enough, right now, they're swimming back up Maine rivers and into Maine ponds where the adults will spawn, leave their eggs in there. They'll go back out to the open ocean. The juveniles will take off, hang out in the estuary for about a year, possibly 2. And then they'll spend their first 3 to 4 of their years of their life up and down the East Coast, maybe not quite down as far as I had that go, but down into the Carolinas. And they'll come back to spawn at age 3 or 4 and can spawn multiple times, and their top lifespan is around 10 years. And so looking at a history of alewife landings, you can see this species and the management is not without its problems. And I remember I said it's a problem-solving kind of situation. So you can see landings were pretty high historically and went down to nearly 0 in 1995. And since they've rebuilt, I think partly because of co-management, a lot of it because of restoration efforts too. But we'll go into all that as we continue through this story. So river herring are managed at 3 different levels, which really provides some opportunity for co-management at each of these levels to a greater degree as we kind of go down in scale, and you'll see that. So at the federal level, they're ultimately managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Council, and that's a group of states that have river herring within their boundaries, and they get together and do assessments and make decisions on that species as a whole in that range that you can see here on the left, that pink outline box. And so with this, at this level, you have very little opportunity for real engagement by fishermen or stakeholders. There's the public speaking process as part of all these rules, but it's like 2 minutes a person, and you're talking to them right before they make a decision. So the actual opportunity for collaboration, it really doesn't exist too much there. One thing it does have for it is it's got blunt tools. And so one example of a tool that was useful was, and when you saw that decline just after that, the federal government put a moratorium on river herring catches, commercial fishing, unless a state was able to come up with a sustainable fishery management plan that they signed off on. And in that document, I won't read this quote, but it had this one little nugget that kind of left the door open to collaborative management. And that was allowing states to use socioeconomic considerations when coming up with sort of strategies for how to rebuild the stocks. And then moving down one level, we've got the state of Maine, the Maine Department of Marine Resources, that are then responsible to provide that fisheries management and be within the guidelines of the federal government. And again, we're getting down to, there's different issues for different stocks. Maine alewife are actually really lucky. They are caught less in bycatch fisheries. We've got a lot of restoration going on up here. We've still got cold water in most of our streams and ponds. And so we've got a great opportunity, and we've got different circumstances than other states do. So we're really getting to a better level of what the fishery needs at this level. But that said, we've got about 3,000 miles of coastline and about 5 to 10 employees, some seasonal, working at DMR with anadromous fish. And so the real capacity to do work at the level in this countless streams that alewife exists really isn't there. And then going down to the finest level, finest scale here, we've got people in towns that have ponds and streams in them that have seen these fish come back for decades and centuries. And so this shows you that the town of Penobscot, where we've kind of in the Bagaduce drainage, where we've really dug in on these grassroots efforts to affect our work in other policy areas. And so you've got Bailey Bowden here, a local harvester and person who wants to see more alewives in streams and ponds. And I would say that the amount of capacity there with him and other volunteers and stewards really takes the first prize as far as the amount of capacity to really do the monitoring and the management and the restoration work. And it's really MCCF's job to work across these boundaries and these kind of unlikely partners of fisheries management to make things work and to improve management. So this is just a look at, and like I said, we're digging into what this capacity at that local level looks like. So this is basically our drainage in the Bagaduce estuary, the pond. We've got 5 ponds, Pierce's, White's in Penobscot, Parker in Brooksville, Frost in Sedgwick, and Walker Pond kind of is in the boundary between the towns of Sedgwick and Brooksville. And you can see there's fish in 3 of these ponds. There were 3 ponds that actually had fish that were running back into them and back out to sea. And then these 2 little lines at Parker Pond and going into Frost Pond are an old dam that's impassable and a culvert across Route 15 down where we are that fish can't get up and in and out of. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Those 2 places are where fish used to be but aren't anymore. And to get into the capacity at the people kind of level, really we'll have to go back about 5 or 6 years ago when I first started at MCCF, where we had about 10 folks, fishermen, community members come in and pile into our office, and we could do that sort of thing and sit down in front of a bunch of big white pieces of paper and talk to us about what they wanted to have happen and where they were frustrated and what they wanted to see in the future when it came to alewives. And so they decided to form a 3-town alewife committee. So each town had their own alewife committee that was dedicated to working on this. And we came up with this 10-year vision, which was to monitor the alewife populations that existed here, restore access in places where alewife had existed but weren't, and restore all those, manage the alewife populations in the Bag of Deuce, and open a non-commercial fishery at Walker Ponds and make this all sustainable. And really this fits into that, the way it fits into that state management is that if a town can monitor their population and show that they have a sustainably harvestable population, they're actually even allowed to prosecute a commercial fishery and to create a management plan for that fishery. And so it's that connection that towns have to those fisheries that the state recognized and was able to convince basically the federal government that this is the way to get people involved in keeping alewife populations going and bringing back old ones. And so, like I said, that takes monitoring. It takes about 10 years of counting fish and taking scales off fish for biological samples. So the way we count fish in most streams is we split the day up into 4-hour periods and count with a little pitch counter. I don't know if I have one right next to me this time of year, but and sit there for half an hour during each of these blocks counting fish. And some of the counts will be up to over 3,000 fish in a half an hour at the spot you can see here. And we also, like I said, take biological samples. We take scales from each fish. We look to see whether they're male or female, and those scales you can actually count annuli, they call them, the lines on the rings, to find out how old they are. And with river herring, you can actually tell how many times they've spawned before, which tell you a little bit more about, those are called repeat spawners, and tells you more about the health of the fishery. And these communities that we work with are pretty amazing and really have gone beyond just counting and doing the sampling that they're required to do. They had questions about what barriers fish could make it over in some of their restoration projects. They had questions about why different ponds produce more fish and then another pond. So inter-pond variability between how the juveniles do, and things like how long they spend in the estuary. So from left to right, you can see we worked on a pit tagging study on the left, where we put these little tags that work like an easy pass on the highway that tell you when a fish goes past an antenna that we implanted in the fish and tracked them going upstream. The middle picture, we're just running a purse stain actually to catch juvenile alewives, to look at health and abundance numbers based on escapement, total numbers of returning adults. And on the right, we're in the estuary looking at different habitats where river herring might be staying, so that the town could adapt their what's it called, basically their plan for the town, their use and things like that, on what sort of habitat they wanted to protect and keep development out of. And then I hadn't mentioned this, but in Walker Pond, the fish actually there are a little smaller. And so back in the 80s, a fisheries biologist with the DMR had sort of declared these pygmy alewives and said, we're not going to harvest these fish. And the town, was watching these hundreds of thousands of fish come back, wondering why they couldn't catch them again. And so it was basically because they were named pygmy or dwarf alewives, and they were looked at almost as a subspecies. So this is my sort of cartoon at what a pygmy alewife is. nobody really knew what it was and why they were smaller fish. But what we did was we said, okay, well, let's answer this question. We've got some expertise in this, and we made some connections with the University of California, Santa Cruz, and folks at Maine, and we were able to do zooplankton sampling here in the top left or top and bottom left. We caught juveniles and looked at their otoliths that you can see up on the top right that can show you even like finer detail on how quickly or slowly fish leave the pond. One of the theories that this guy had was they spend 2 years in the pond instead of just the summer and fall. And so we were able to show that they did in fact just spend a couple months in the pond before leaving. And we even we did DNA testing to show that they weren't any different than any other North Atlantic population. And so this year is pretty exciting. It's actually our first year being able to recreational harvest again there. And we were able to convince the state to reopen that to a harvest where honestly it's a physical connection to the fish, which is what kept people connected to the fishery. And they do other small work. So this, again, back to this capacity level, there's 2 beaver dams that live down below Walker Pond as one example. And this time of year, we're pulling the dams down a foot and a couple feet wide every other day because they keep building it back up. And as soon as the dam is built back up, the fish stop moving through. And so if it weren't for these, hours and hours of community service, counting, doing beaver dams, doing sampling, having alewife committee meetings, going out and talking with students to do this, so on why this is important. I did kind of a back of the napkin addition sort of thing, and it ends up being around 300 hours of community service that goes into each one of these runs. And so it's a lot of capacity. And again, back to the restoration piece, this is something where MCCF isn't a land trust. We don't, have to do these big projects that are restoration projects, but we have partners at the Nature Conservancy and especially at Maine Coast Heritage Trust that are in that business. And so these are some before after pictures at Pierce Pond in Penobscot and in Wight's Pond down there. And you can see they went from a place where there were dams where fish had to be physically dipped from the stream to the ponds to these free-flowing fishways where they could go with their own volition. And back to this thing where we've got these 2 little red lines, 2021 is a pretty exciting year because this is the year that those are going to get fixed. So there's going to be restoration projects this July that'll open these streams up to fish passage, and we'll at that point basically have the Bagaduce drainage all the way open to historic levels. And ahead of those restoration projects, we've been stocking fish for the past, it was our 4th year this year, from Walker Pond into Parker and Frost Pond. And to be able to have those fish come back, like I said, after 3 years and start spawning again. And excitingly, just ahead of the projects, we had fish come back into Snows Brook that goes to Frost Pond this year. And they came back, the project wasn't completed, but we were able to dip as many fish as we could and put together a makeshift kind of fishway that got the thousands of fish that showed up for their first year coming back. And so that was really exciting. And really it's about, there's a lot of wording in the amendments at the federal level about how, we need to do education and outreach and things like that, but they're not in our schools and they're not in our communities, and neither is the DMR because they don't have the capacity to do that. But these community members that have kids and grandkids in these schools are out there and are the ones that they trust. And you can see kids out in the brook helping fish get back over a screen that we had to keep them from going up to the dam. And by the way, you can see in this right-hand picture, there's no fish above that screen and the bottom is just black with fish. Those kids could probably walk over it, they're so light. And really that capacity is values, it comes in that form of values. These fish they're bait, they're food for fish that are commercially caught in other areas, whether halibut bait or lobster bait, or food for cod and other ground fish. And their connections, I was asked by a reporter why people do this, spend that many hours working on this. Well, when you're a fishing community and you have almost the same day every year, you get about 500,000 fish that come from the ocean and swim up your, across under a bridge and go into a pond that you swim in all summer, you're going to get pretty connected to those fish. And that connection really is the capacity. And so where MCCF really fits into this, like I said, it's working across those boundaries. It's understanding, the state's obligation, their capacity limitations, what their job is. The same with the federal government, and really the values and all those things I talked about in the communities, and to work across those and build that relationship and build that trust and create conversations. And so some of it has been at the state and federal work where, like I said, towns need to come up with 10 years of data to prove they have a sustainably harvestable fishery. Well, 10 years of 300 hours is a lot of work when it's hard to get even, a town road cleanup done where people only spend an hour a day, cleaning up roads around here. To get someone to put in, a group of people to put in 3,000 hours over 10 years is nearly impossible. So we worked with the state and got them we put together a white paper for them that would be an amendment to or an addendum to the state fisheries management plan to the federal government that would allow some commercial harvest at fewer than 10 years, but at a graduated level, and to be able to create that connection and really incentivize the stewardship that these folks are undertaking. And that passed, and yet last year was the first year there was a commercial fishery in Penobscot in recent memory. So it was a really exciting kind of achievement for co-management and for our work specifically. And it's local policy work too, just working with towns that aren't used to working on fisheries management and standing up that model of local management in their alewife committees and showing them what the scale data means and what which fish are coming in first and what a harvest would look like and what would be the results. And at the really big level, after started diving into this local level and understanding the ins and outs of the parts of co-management, a new undertaking that is really exciting is a partnership that we have with another organization called Manamet, and it's working to put together a river herring network that really takes the silos of these community members, these local fishermen, the state and federal managers, and educational institutions like UMaine, Massachusetts, and other institutions to really look across those boundaries and to stand that combined capacity up. And so these are just shots. The left one is a map of something we put together for a webinar we had last October, November, that showed all the different, either whether it was, like I said, tribal, or whether it was institutional education or the state or federal government or local projects. This kind of just shows the hubs and little spots that really cover that area in a really neat way. And this is one Zoom shot of our webinar, but we had like 50 people at the meeting, and we've had a second meeting that really showed us that people want to be part of a network. And so that's some important work that we're trying to fund going forward. And I'm happy to work with our partner at Manamet and my partner working on it, Ann Hayden. I think it's on here, so thanks, Ann. And so that's river herring, that's alewives, really what co-management can do. But it's not just alewives. I really look at co-management as a continuum where, on one hand, you've got no management, and really you don't have to look that far long ago to no management where it wasn't co-management. It was just, if you wanted to call it management, it was a fisherman managing it. And then around 100 years ago, things started changing where the federal government said, yeah, these fish are kind of going away. We might want to stop things or change things or do something about it. And so that led to this real top-down traditional fisheries management that I'll call it on the right side, where it's, you've got a quota, you've got a limited entry or no entry into a fishery, and there's just really strict rules about who can catch what, when, and how. And so these different fisheries, I didn't do this, scientifically as far as putting this on there, nothing to score points or anything, but in the middle is co-management. And you've got fish like the groundfish fisheries and the elver fishery off on the right that, again, you need to pay for a license for, you get a quota for, and you're told when and where and how you can get fish. And then off on the left, you've got things like invasive species like green crab or suckers as bait fish, where you just kind of need, or even periwinkles, where you've got to get one license, and then it's kind of a free-for-all as far as when and how much you get. And then closer to the middle, you've got shellfish, river herring, and we'll talk about some other examples. So one example I'll talk about, because MCCF really did a lot of work in this, is the scallop fishery. And so this is a a shot of landings prior to 2010, and you can see again, back to that problem-solving sort of relationship, we really had an issue where our scallop landings were going far, far down. And so in 2010, the Department of Marine Resources, actually when the stock was starting to rebound and they really didn't want to tank it again, came to MCCF and asked if we would work with fishermen to try to get that local capacity, that knowledge into some of the management solutions that they hoped would happen. And so our chief scientist, Carla Gunther, and her team held over 60 meetings with 150 of the 700 licensed fishermen over a year and a half. And in that year and a half, we're able to put together, just looking at maps, putting dots and circles and numbers and writing down their thoughts on what to do with this. They came up with an idea that you'll see off on the right as a map here of a 2-year rotational, 10-year rotational management plan where these sites would open and close year by year and give the stocks time to rebound. And it's worked pretty well since then. There's other reasons for this, of course, but our landings have gone up since then. And to this day, they still use, even in their in-season management, a lot of the data that they use for opening and closing areas is based on fisherman knowledge. Again, with looking at the scallop fishery as co-management, this is a great way to show the functional side of co-management. But there are some sort of more institutional ways of looking at it too. And one of those in scallops is the fact that they have a scallop advisory council that isn't as functional as this. It's more set up and institutional. It's basically a group of fishermen that are appointed, and scientists and some other stakeholders that are appointed by the Maine DMR commissioner, and that can weigh in and make recommendations to the commissioner on different fishery management decisions. And that's something that the state, you'll see, has in other areas. But again, it's the co-management part is that relationship that they were willing to build, and whether the fact that they were willing to listen to fishermen and their understanding of where these lines should be and what kind of management plan there should be. When it comes to lobster, of course, we can't talk about fisheries in Maine without hitting on lobster a little bit. But I would say the collaborative management there, again, there at the state level, there is a lobster advisory council that looks at things statewide. And then even more granular, our Maine state waters are split up into zones. You can see them on this map here to the right. And each of those zones has a zone council. And those zone councils are allowed to hold their own meetings, put together their own agendas, and they're actually in statute able to regulate, with the commissioner's approval, the numbers of traps fished in that zone, the traps, the kind of traps that are allowed, or number of traps that are allowed per trawl. They're allowed to regulate the times of day when fishing can occur. And we talked about limited entry, so that's basically when a person can get a fishing license in a fishery. And so there's more people waiting in most of these zones than there are available licenses. And as people leave the fishery, those go to people on this waiting list in a ratio. So sometimes it's, if 3 people leave the fishery, 1 new person gets a license, or it could be the opposite. 1 person leaves and 3 get a license or whatever. But they're allowed to weigh in on what that ratio is to really regulate the number of licenses that are in their area. And they're also allowed to weigh in on the apprenticeship program that's talking about kids coming up from school, or folks working on boats with captains and getting an apprenticeship. And they are allowed to, those are the ones that are in law, but they're also allowed to take up other issues and make recommendations to the commissioner as well. And outside of that, they're actually, outside of these lettered boxes, they're federally managed. And so again, like the ASMFC example with river herring, there's some public input possibilities there, but it's pretty limited. And so the collaborative management at that level is a little bit further to the traditional side than it is the co-management side. So shellfish is another fishery where I specifically work. It's probably the second fishery in Maine that actually has some real solid infrastructure around co-management. And so at the Maine state level, broadly, the state of Maine DMR public health actually manages shellfish. But because of their understanding that each town's different, each flat's different, and long understanding of this, has been around for a long time, the differences, understood at these town and flat levels, the state of Maine allows the towns, if they want to manage their own fisheries. And so this comes in the form of a town first creating an ordinance. So basically a town says, we want to manage our own fisheries. And if they create an ordinance and create a shellfish committee, they can do a lot of similar things to what those zone councils can do, where they can create bag limits, regulate possession of shellfish. They can work on conservation programs to provide protection from predators. They can open and close flats to, if one's getting harvested really hard, they can close that for several years if they want. They can even affect mussel dragging on intertidal area, and they can establish size limits on their shellfish and even set license fees. And actually, one thing that's goes above and beyond even river herring is they not only can but are required to hire a warden to enforce their shellfish rules. And so there's a whole lot of tools that a town has to be able to manage that fishery. A big piece of that where we work is trying to give them, again, just like the alewife committees, is to be able to give them the capacity to be able to be good managers. So any good state or federal fishery is well informed by science. It has good rules and it has people working on that. And so the work we're doing is really to give them those tools of how to understand what your resources look like, what the possibilities are out there, and where to get help and capacity. And really our angle is giving them capacity by working with them as groups and bringing them together. So what we've done over the past several years, understanding again that there's really granular differences from town to town, but there's really big differences, kind of grouping down East Maine and Southern Maine in different areas. And so MCCF has worked and with a group of organizations. We work with the Down East Fisheries Partnership, has worked with Down East shellfish committees from Penobscot all the way to Eastport, and has brought them together to talk about, what they really, what the limits are of what they can do. And I don't mean by what the limits are, it's like what the sky limit is, like how much can we really dig into this and leverage this local management. So we've some of it has been co-learning kind of opportunities where we've talked about the legislative process and how to weigh into that. And other pieces have been ecological, how we can understand more about what's in our flats, what other towns are doing, and just bringing folks together to make them the most effective local managers we can. And so we've had several convenings down east, bringing these committees together. And it's pretty incredible what getting together. We added it up in one meeting. It was like, I think it was like 500 years of experience on the flats that we were bringing into a room. And that capacity, again, is just can't be left on the table when we're trying to effectively manage our fisheries. And really to kind of wrap things up, you've really got to look at the challenges. It's a really neat concept, but it's not easy to really have it be implemented in the way it has to make things really go the extra mile. Like I said, it's hard for people to understand. There isn't one simple recipe. You'll see some scientific papers where they try to make a diagram on the decision making process and things like that. And that's important and good for evaluating it. But again, with so many different examples that change over time, it's really something that you've got to look at the same way you would a relationship. And that again is all about trust. And those are the challenges and tough things. But MCCF really believes that if we can make this work and get people to buy into it and want to do this at all the different parties, we really can sustain our fisheries and our communities. And I think it's going to take co-management to do that. So I hope I came across pretty clear there. And with that, I'll just show you my little kiddos connection to our local alewife fishery. And if you have any questions, Paul can siphon those off to me.
Very good, Mike. We had a question typed into the chat by from Sarah. Actually, we had two, and I answered one of them in writing, but maybe let you take a look at both of these. One is, why are scallops treated separately from shellfish? And she asked that when you were talking about the municipal shellfish management work.
Right. So I would say the main reason why they're treated differently is because of the actual fishing methodology for catching them. So scallops are caught by boat, so either diving off a boat or dragging from a boat. And so that's how that fishery is prosecuted. And it's prosecuted in those different open and closed areas along the coast, further out past what a town's really jurisdiction would be. And then the shellfish is harvested in the intertidal, because that's where you actually have clam or sand and mud that's, you know, you can actually dig into to get the clams. And that's how they're harvested, is by, you know, digging them out or pulling them out by hand. And so that it's really there's a solid boundary there just because of the intertidal where they're harvested from. So hopefully that answers it.
Good. She also asks, what's MCCF doing with aquaculture?
Oh, and I forgot to mention, so there's a advisory council I said for scallops. There's also one for lobsters. There is also one for aquaculture, shellfish, seaweed, and sea urchin. So those are the fisheries that the state appoints, you know, a committee that is supposed to represent the industry and the communities and bring feedback to the state when they make decisions. I would say that one place that MCCF works across most of those is, and really I'll tell you a limitation about those advisory councils. Really, they're set up to provide what I would say is that connection that co-management needs. But unless those, you know, the people that are running those advisory councils have a lot of, unless they're given employees to work on, to help do some of that co-learning, create relationships with the people on there that are really long-lasting connections, to be able to even do simple things like create an agenda for the next meeting. Unless it's really given, you know, kind of care and feeding, the advisory councils can't possibly do what they're supposed to provide that connection. And so MCCF, the seaweed one, that's what it was for, right? Was it aquaculture or seaweed?
Aquaculture. Yeah.
Okay. So there is an aquaculture AC. They don't meet that often at all. But across the other ones, that is one place where MCCF does play a role in trying to add capacity to those advisory councils. And I would say with aquaculture, where we fit in is we're really at a pivotal time right now with aquaculture and development, and the decisions that this, you know, states can have to make on what they want aquaculture to look like in the future. And we're really connected with a lot of the main parties that are part of that discussion, whether it's Maine Sea Grant that Paul used to head up, or like I mentioned, the Down East Fisheries Partnership, which is 10 organizations in Down East Maine that are having a lot of conversations with regulators and with researchers and other folks. And so at this point, I would say we're part of the conversation and trying to make sure that what the decisions that are made are ones that are compatible with the fisheries that we have now and with Maine communities, you know, being sustained the way they are, with fishing being a big part of that. Paul, you can add to that if you want.
No, I think that was good. We're, you know, certainly we see the aquaculture as part of a seafood system with fisheries, and they need to blend. They need to be collaborative and should be having common goals. There are ways that aquaculture can certainly expand in a sustainable way, and there's probably some ways that aquaculture could do less sustainable behaviors. So we're trying to pay attention to that whole spectrum. But at this point, we don't have any, and none of our staff are specifically tasked to aquaculture-related projects right now. We have a couple questions that came in on the Q&A, and folks, if you have other questions, you can either use the chat or the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. But we have two here. First, Mike Timpson is asking, Mike, what's the biggest economic value for alewives?
No, that's a good question. So economic value, I mean, I'll go through kind of a list of them. So they could be food for people. That used to be one of the bigger values. If you went to a bar in, you know, Boston 60, 80 years ago, you weren't eating pretzels, you were eating smoked alewives. There's a reason why there's a metro station named after them. So there's definitely potential. So not right now. I mean, right now they're not being sold a lot for food, but as far as value added, I don't know if folks haven't had a smoked alewife, if you can track one down, you should try one. They're delicious. So I think biggest potential, it could be as a value added food product. But that said, right now it's probably as commercial fisheries bait. They make much preferred halibut bait and lobster bait than other fish that you're not getting as fresh this time of year. So it's kind of nice. They're coming in right at the same time the halibut fishery is happening, and so you're getting these fish that are, a day old rather than something that's coming in from a boat in a box from somewhere else. So right now I would say it's bait. But in the long run, or in potential, it might be as a value-added product. And as far as the bait fishery goes, you can see that our landings have actually gone up. I think they were close to 2 million pounds just a few years ago. One thing that could up that potential for bait is more infrastructure. So right now it's these smaller towns. There's a couple larger fisheries, but really the production can't keep up with the demand for the bait. And so they're just, if there's a fishery like Ellsworth or Orland, which are the two biggest, closest ones to us, there's a line of fishermen waiting every high tide, and you take a number or get in line, and every fish gets, bought, and some people go home empty-handed. So if there was more bait coming in from all these different little places and some infrastructure set up to store these fish, and maybe sell them when other bait is more limited, maybe later in the summer when the shed's further on and herring are not being caught as much, there's potential for that to be a little bit higher. So it's bait and food, and they both have a little bit more possibility than they're currently working at.
Great, thanks for that question, Mike. Here's one from a colleague, Ann Hayden. We know her, right, Mike?
Yep.
Ann's asking a good question. Can co-management be a stepping stone to ecosystem-based fisheries management?
Yeah, so I was going to put in a slide on EBFM, but if you think co-management's vague and hard to get your hands and head around, just to give you an idea, I think one of the talks Paul gave on EBFM, or ecosystem-based fisheries management plan, was called the greased pig, I believe, because you just can't get your hand around it. So that's why I put it in there. But basically, it's doing this co-management at a real broad level, looking 40 miles out into the ocean and 40 miles in, looking at all the fisheries together, and interactions between species and management practices. So it's really the long game of what we're going for here. And I think it's a stepping stone for sure, and a bridge, and the only way that we'll get there. And I think the cases that we're showing for co-management, these drainage levels that are having federal and state policy effects, are a great example that it can happen, because there's some of those same components there. So excellent question, Ann.
Nice, Ann. Here's an interesting question, Mike. Somebody wants advice. What advice can you offer to Yarmouth, which is down home of the Clam Festival? Yarmouth's Royal River is blocked by unused old dams. Thus, there's no alewife migration. Local clams are apparently much less abundant than 100 years ago. What data might help fuel remedies for increasing alewife and clam populations?
So they're blocked. So it's looking like this. There's no fish anymore where there used to be. So this is, first of all, I guess I would encourage them to shoot me an email and become part of our river herring network, because I think a big goal of this network is to be able to give resources for towns that want to do this similar work. And really it ends up being, trying to maybe have them tied to a local group. I think like Maine Rivers is further south. That's an organization, a nonprofit that works on restoration projects. So it might be getting a hold of someone there. Landis Hudson actually is the only person that works there, and she's our ED. So that might be a route to go to. So honestly, I would say start looking for places that can add capacity, whether it's a land trust that can help with fundraising for some of these dams that might need to be removed and remediated. And then talk to other folks. Like I said, joining this our river herring network might not be a bad idea to find out, how would I, just the simple things like how do I make an alewife committee in my town? How do I find out, what's the map that says where alewife used to be? Because there is some not great, but decent maps on where they used to be. And even if they're not on there, how you can prove whether using, anecdotal data, or even now they're looking at being able to take core samples out of sediment and look 100 years old at DNA that's stuck in the mud to find out whether you had river herring. So there's a whole lot of stuff that I could go through, but I would say just try to connect to these capacity building efforts that either NGOs have going on or groups of them have going on. Good question.
That's good. I don't remember if there's a Friends of the Royal River. It seems to me there was at one point, but on the river network, Landis could certainly point you in the right direction. Thanks for that question. We had a chat question that I answered, but I'll go ahead and let everybody know. Robert had asked if alewives were the same as menhaden, and I told him alewife is the same as river herring, and that menhaden are different, and they're also called pogies.
Yep.
I don't know if there's obvious distinction between the two. They're both relatively the same fish, and they spool and migrate at different times of year. The menhaden are not diagamous, so.
Yeah, pogies stay in the salt water their whole life.
And Sarah's asking, after you mentioned my talk a while ago that I had done on EBFM, if we have that recorded, and I don't think we do. I think that was a traditional PowerPoint, but Sarah, can you reach out to me separately and we can talk, and there may be a way for me to share some parts of that with you. All right, Mike wants to know, what's the difference between an alewife and American shad?
So they are pretty close. They're both alicines. So the alewife is Alosa pseudopharyngus, and that's Alosa something else, I forget, as far as species names. So they're pretty close. They share a pretty similar life history. Shad actually found in a big river. I'm pretty sure shad spawn in the actual river itself as opposed to the pond. I'm not a real shad expert myself, but shad are much larger fish, and their diet's a little bit different, and they'll go after some bigger things than alewife. But if you had a picture of a shad and shrunk it down on my PowerPoint thing, you'd probably get to the point where you wouldn't be able to tell a whole lot difference between that and an alewife. But they're managed. One note, since this is a management talk, is they're managed by the same board of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission.
And the state does stock shad, right?
Yeah. And they stock alewives.
Yeah. I think we're at the end of our questions here. We're getting on towards, we have a little bit more time. If anybody's got another question you'd like to put in there. In the meantime, I'll remind you again that we do these monthly. So the next one will be in June. It will be, I think it's June 25th. And you'll hear more about that. It's going to be on climate change. And we have an interesting discussion where I'm going to bring a bunch of young folks, fishermen and other young students and community people that are interested in climate change and how it impacts our fisheries. And they're the ones who are inheriting the mess that we find ourselves in. So I thought it would be a really interesting panel discussion to get some young people talking about climate change. So that'll be in June, at the end of June. And I don't have any more questions. So check us out on the web. If you're in Stonington, please come by and visit. We are opening to the public again, and we're doing so safely, but we would love to see you and visit you. Our Discovery Wharf Interpretive Center, which is on Stonington Harbor in our building, will be opening up at the end of June 22nd. And we're going to be taking reservations for small groups to come in and have the facility for 45-minute periods at a time, and then clean it up and just try to honor the hygiene and health and safety of our staff and visitors. But we're very excited to slowly transition back into interacting with all of you. Thanks again for attending, and have yourselves a nice, good long holiday weekend.